Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right. Well, the subtitle is Conversation in an Age of Rage, Kirilov's book, At a Loss for Words, tackling that topic. She joins us on the program to discuss it. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Michael. Thank you.
Very happy to have you on here. This is a weighty book with a lot to unpack. I don't even know where to start, so I want to start with where you started on this book.
Well, I was still working as the host of CBC As It Happens, and I was over the years hearing conversations which were always a bit lively and sometimes confrontational, and then they just turned downright nasty. And I was hearing that in our own interviews. I was hearing that elsewhere in the media, especially because we interviewed a lot of Americans. The As It Happens has a audience in the U.S. and the rancor was really alarming. And then I started seeing it sort of in everyday life, just the degree to which people were in some state of rage. They didn't just disagree with people; they hated the people they disagreed with and wanted them dead. And I thought, okay, we've turned a corner here, and I want to explore that.
So then at that point, like, how do you go about putting a book like this together? Because you do land on, several kind of key words and use those as jumping off points for like larger discussions. But like taking, these people are not talking the same language and then extrapolating to what you've got on the page here. How do you start that process?
Well, what I know from years of being a journalist, not just on the radio, but before that, decades working in the field. And I covered a lot of really awful situations, wars and conflicts. And everybody always seems to think that things happen spontaneously, that suddenly everybody is in an uproar, that there is a war, or there's conflict, or there's anger, division, violence. But it all starts much, much earlier with language and rhetoric. So I was conscious of the fact that it's words, it's the words we use and how we use them that are really the advance party of conflict. And so when the language turns ugly, and people are actually not just being nasty to each other, but the language is being, it was clear to me, manipulated and weaponized and used against people in a way that I thought was against civil society, I start to realize that there are agendas going on here, and those agendas are leading us down a very dark path. So my spidey senses told me that this sort of advanced party of rhetoric was what could be a preparation for something far darker, and not necessarily culture wars don't always lead to physical wars, but they usually and almost invariably start with culture wars.
You had mentioned that the program, you spoke to a lot of Americans on As It Happens, and that this is where you first started seeing it. But as you point out and say the topic freedom, this is not just a U.S. issue. Here in Canada, there is a co-option or a perversion of the word freedom.
Well, there's always been, since the word was invented by Greeks and Romans in antiquity, there have been these conflicting views of what freedom is, and freedom has been it surfaces every so many hundreds of years as the freedom from responsibility to others, the freedom to do what you want, the freedom from government, the freedom to be left alone, and that's sort of in the United States and to a lesser degree in Canada, that view of freedom has been the domain of the right, of conservatives. There's this other view of freedom, which is the one that's the freedom from tyranny, to be liberated from oppression. This is the freedom that Martin Luther King Jr. speaks of. This is the freedom that Nelson Mandela spoke of from Robben Island. This is the freedom that Franklin Delano Roosevelt spoke of when in the 1930s, when he said that people should be free from want, that they need to have some sort of social safety net. This is the very beginning of what we now have, which is the programs and the government and the network of aids that help us to equalize things, to give people who don't have what they need to survive. Those people get that from the people who do have more than they need to survive. So all that's the idea of freedom that I subscribe to, and that's the freedom that I believe is very much part of liberal democracy. And so we just in the past years, recent years, especially during the so-called Freedom Convoy and what we saw in January 6th, 2021 in Washington, when they stormed the mobs stormed that Capitol building, was this view that people should be liberated from obligations to others, that free to do what you want, free to take what you want. And so that's the argument that's the conflict of that word that I wanted to explore, and I do so in the first chapter of this book.
Yeah, no, the freedom, when you mentioned, the Roman and the Greek conceptions of it and that they differed, even in democracy, the chapter on democracy, there's, some historical concepts around the failings of democracy, or at least, the fact that particularly in the United States, a place that was founded with the notions of democracy, that, there was a significant portion of the population that didn't have the vote. How much research or work were you doing to flesh out the kind of historical aspects of this in order to then address kind of the current and future use of the language?
Well, I mean, going back to its origins, right? So again, as with freedom, I look back at how the Greeks and Romans conceived of it when they invented the idea, and what they wanted of it, which was that they wanted to, again, it's freedom and democracy are very closely tied. And the Greeks and Romans wanted to be liberated from tyrants, from kings and autocrats and despots. And so they conceived of this idea that the people should be those who choose who rules them, and not bloodlines and divine right of kings. And so that was the origins of democracy. Very important, and carries on to this day. What was wrong at the time in antiquity, and continues to be wrong through history, is that democracy is not inclusive of all people. It doesn't give the voter franchise to large swaths of populations. Only a very small number of Greeks and Romans were able to vote in this democracy, and that would be men who had property, and there were other people who had influence, and people who were didn't have that franchise. And then you get through history, you see the same thing repeats itself, and that was the battle in the United States, which was regarded quite rightly as the sort of beacon of modern day liberal democracy. But the Americans, even it took generations before the large parts of the population were given the opportunity to vote and to participate in democracy. And that I'm speaking of people of color, obviously Black Americans, African Americans, and women. And so in Canada, it was very long before we included the majority of people. Indigenous people weren't given the vote until the 1960s, and they were told they could only have the vote if they gave up their status as Indigenous people. People in of Asian origin throughout Canada it was well into the last century before they had the vote. So this has always been this difficulty about democracy, is that that we think it's a great idea, but then as soon as we get the idea that everyone should have a chance to say who is in charge, we say, well, yes, but not those people. We don't want them to be having a vote. We don't want them to have that opportunity. So there's always this battle to limit who gets to be in the club. And so what I argue in the book is that, yes, we need to retake democracy, because I think it's been the word has been demonized and discredited, especially in the United States right now. Yes, we have to reclaim it and take it, but we can only do so if we make sure that the majority of people, the vast majority of people, get to benefit from it.
You had said, being in the club there, it seems that some of the most strident, perverters of this word right now are the people who were in the club and had exclusive membership and are now seeing other people join it and then don't want to be part of that club anymore.
Basically, that's how I saw it, and I think that's true. And I think that's those who are saying that, and this is a movement in the States around Donald Trump to say, well, we never really said we wanted to be a democracy, we're a republic, which doesn't make sense. But the this idea that democracy is it doesn't benefit. Some of the democracy is not benefited from everybody having a vote. And they say that democracy is against freedom because you can't be free to do whatever you want and have whatever you want and have to include everybody else in your freedom. So there's this struggle now to say that Americans around Trump who are saying, well, we can't really be free unless we limit the democracy aspect and limit the numbers of people who are getting something. I'd say benefit, but they'd say just stealing from us. And so they want to be able to limit the amount of democracy. They want to limit the participation in it and the value of having governments that are serving the majority of people and not just the elites.
Throughout the book, you pepper in some folks that you've either done interviews with or covered in some way, and then also some of your own experiences. I'm curious how much you thought about whether to include yourself in this book.
Well, as you know, as a journalist, it's very difficult to pass across that line into putting yourself in the story and making yourself part of the narrative. And so I didn't do that with I did that carefully and gingerly. But I tell stories about my own family, growing up, my own experiences, my own encounters with people, not as a way to sort of insert myself into the narrative and have you all think I'm terrific, because I'm sure you won't. But as because I feel that after the decades I've spent in the field, working as a journalist, covering stories around the world, the years I put in talking to tens of thousands of people on radio and television, that I felt I was coming from a place of experience and from a point of view that was informed. And so if I put myself in the story, I was doing so as part of the point of view of the story, of saying, this is where I come from. This is who my family was. This is who my father and my mother were. This is what they valued. This is the city I spent my first years in. And so I felt that if I could tell the story from that point of view, that and show people where I came from, that they could understand why I cared about these words and why I worry that we're losing them.
In the introduction, you mentioned Robert Macfarlane's book, The Lost Words, a spell book, and the fact that he's talking about the natural world and that there's disappearing words for things in nature, and he's worried that if we don't have these words, we won't protect the concepts or understand them fully. And then you go on to write that in some sense what's happening in political vocabulary is a twisted version of this. I am curious, did his book serve as a jumping off point for you?
Oh, very much so. I really admire Robert Macfarlane. That was one of my favorite interviews. I interviewed him a couple of times on As It Happens. And I thought that he had a brilliant idea, which was that to reclaim these words and he began this campaign around the world of bringing these words into schools. So the book is, I don't know if you've ever seen his book, Lost Words, but it's stunningly beautiful. And so he wrote poems. He would take the word like willow or otter or dandelion, these words from nature that he believed that he found that they had been removed from the Oxford Youth Dictionary and replaced with words of technology like broadband and Gmail. And so he wanted children to get these words back. And so he wrote poems and celebrated these words and brought otters and beavers and willows into the vocabulary of children. And they would, everywhere he would go, he'd show up and the kids had already got the book and they'd memorized these poems about these words, and they loved the words, and then their teachers were taking them on field trips to see all the words in nature that he was saying that had been removed from the dictionary, and we needed to take them back. And so absolutely, it wasn't just the book, but him, and how it caught on with so many people that they needed these words, because if you don't have the word, then they cease to exist. The idea ceases to exist in their imagination. And so if children don't have these words in nature, they don't have the actual plant or the species or the animal. And so I thought, if we don't have the words that represent these very, very important concepts, the words freedom, democracy, truth, and I woke, which is a more recent word, choice, and I finally learned as taxes. If these words have been demonized or weaponized or removed from our common understanding and agreement of what they represent, then they no longer exist in civil society, and they no longer exist in our political imagination. So we can't really recover the things that I value about civil society if we don't have the language to speak about what it is and why it matters.
Well, as you point out in the book, once we don't have that word, or at least there's not an agreement on the word, you can't have a rational conversation about something if you don't agree on the underlying concept behind something, and that ultimately is the purpose of the people who are obfuscating with these words.
Oh, absolutely. It's the purpose of them. I mean, the people like Steve Bannon, who was once part of the inner circle of Donald Trump, probably still is, and large numbers of those people around him. And I think also in conservative politics in Canada, the sort of darker side of it, not all of it, surely, but Steve Bannon talks about how you have to flood the zone with shit. He says that he's not interested in a conversation. He's interested in destroying the enemy, and the enemy being anyone politically opposed to him. Yeah, there are people who definitely politically benefit from driving wedges between us. There are people who benefit from making us into adversaries, and these are the rage farmers that are all through politics now, and it's a way of getting power. One of their most important devices, and this goes through all through history, is to is not to well, they lie about many things, they misrepresent things, but the point isn't to convince you of the lie. Donald Trump doesn't care if you believe his lies. It's just to destroy your ability to discern between the truth and lies, and that's what Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher, warned about how these things begin, that when you can no longer tell the difference between fact and fiction from truth and lies, you can't tell the difference between right and wrong. And when you can't do that, it breaks the bonds of trust within a society, and makes you extremely easy to manipulate. She warns that that's the foundation of all totalitarian regimes, is that to break trust, to break the bond of trusting each other, and break the bonds of society. And so, yeah, I think that people are absolutely trying to benefit from that. Then you add to that the social media, the big tech platforms that actually profit from this kind of adversity. They make money off of the rage and the uncertainty and the anger, because those emotions keep people engaged on their platforms longer. And the longer we stay on their platforms, going further down the rabbit hole of YouTube links, the more money they make, the more data they can scrape from our lives and use to sell advertising. And so you've got the people who, on the one hand, seek power through these divisions, and then this other layered on top that Hannah Arendt could never have imagined. You have these people who are actually making money, or profiting financially from those divisions.
Right, they're both profiting from it, just for different purposes, like
different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because then you write about, following the money, leading you to the writing about taxes as the last word, but like the money fuels all of this.
That's right. Money fuels all of it, and and financial interests, because if you break the ambition of some very, very rich people in the United States, less so in Canada, but we're seeing this in Latin America and Europe, and well, certainly in India, what you see is this need to discredit government, because if you discredit government, if people don't believe in government, they think that government is just that the government's in your face. They're nosy. They're interfering in my life. I got to get rid of the government. Tells me what to do. Once you break the bond with politics, you say that politics is a dirty word, and you turn us against the whole idea of politics, which is the organizing principle of our societies, but turn people against that. But what the benefit for some very wealthy people is that if you discredit and get rid of government and taxation, which is probably the goal there, it's to get rid of regulations, to get rid of climate change mitigation, to get rid of environmental controls, to get rid of social safety net, to get rid of the supports we give to many people, including immigrants, but also to get rid of daycares and get rid of all the things that they believe are part of robbery. That's just a way of using their money to benefit those they feel are less deserving. And so, yeah, the idea of discrediting these institutions, these pillars of society, is to give yourself an opportunity to get rid of government and the government regulations that get in the way of you making money.
And then ultimately, you also talk about, Project 2025, and one of their primary thrusts is to overhaul or basically kneecap the education system and create a populace that won't question these kind of vagaries of how they define things.
Even before the people who like the Heritage Foundation, which funded Project 2025, which is the blueprint that Donald Trump says it's not his blueprint, but because he said he hasn't endorsed it, but everything that he plans to do comes from as identical to Project 2025. That yes, they're one of their tenets is that they will eliminate the Department of Education. The idea is that you get rid of the public school system, and very rich people have been trying to get rid of the public school system for a very long time because they don't want to pay for all these children to get an equal valued education. But it really began, you see it much earlier before Project 2025, and the attacks on universities, because universities are a place where people get independent ideas. And it's a place where you can't control those ideas. Pierre Poilievre has said one of the first things he'll do is to get rid of the gatekeepers at universities. He said that he's going to install a watchdog, which I kind of think is a gatekeeper, but he's going to install watchdogs that will ensure that free speech is functioning on university campuses. And if they fail to demonstrate free speech on campuses, as he sees it, or as how he defines free speech, then he will attempt to defund those institutions from federal coffers. And so you see, and this is the blueprint that we've seen through the United States. We've saw it in Hungary. We see it in many liberal democracies where they have to discredit universities, because universities are a place where people get ideas and they get independent thoughts, and they can't control them. So just like having to discredit the media, you have to discredit these kinds of institutions of higher learning.
Banning books like 1984.
Yes.
Which, their definition of free speech certainly feels like it's pulled directly from an Orwellian version.
Well, certainly lots of people felt that they were living in an Orwellian environment when Donald Trump started talking about alternative facts.
In the book, you write about, and going back to the Trump and the just like storm of lies, like the fact that the media can't keep up, right? That they're like cataloging all the lies, and when he continues lying, refuting them takes time, and the flooding the zone notion, I've heard the saying, the lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth puts its pants on. That this, like, fighting against this, if you're someone who believes in truth, in the like notion of rational truth, how do you battle against something like this? Because the amount of time it takes versus the like ease with which and speed with which these lies happen.
I'm not sure how the media can get around its own limits, because we have established these conventions of both always have both sides having balance, and I don't see how it can work in this environment. I'm seeing the coverage of a plan that Donald Trump has, which is also in Project 2025. But Donald Trump has made it clear that he plans to have as many as 13 or 15 million people rounded up in the United States that he said are illegally in the country. These we're talking about migrants, many of whom have been there for their entire lives, rounding them up, incarcerating them in camps, and deporting them to countries that many of them have never lived in or haven't been in their lifetimes. And we're talking about people. Just imagine this. I mean, that's like practically half the population of Canada. And he will do it over a period of 3 years. He said he will send people into the army will be used in this endeavor. And they will go into people's homes. You'll see your neighbors being dragged out of their apartments. You'll see grandmothers and babies being loaded into trucks. You'll see people that you should be working with at Starbucks or whatever. You come to work and they're not there anymore because they got rounded up during the night. We're talking about millions of people being rounded up and deported to countries that we don't even know where they're going to go. They can be held in camps. They've already requisitioned the land where they want to hold them, and so these are human rights abuses on a scale that's criminal. And yet the media tries to cover it as though, oh, well, this is what his policies are. And here's Kamala Harris's policies. You can't talk about these things rationally. They're not. You can't use the conventions of journalism and cover this. You have to actually call it what it is. I saw the first failing of journalism when it attempted to cover the beginnings of the climate change discussion, when we first started learning that our climate was rapidly changing and it was going to cause disasters of a massive scale. And there were just thousands and thousands. 98% of scientists were part of the documents who were saying, yep, this is what's happening. Every aspect of science is telling us that we're facing a real climate change disaster. And yet journalism had to do the do the other sideism and find that one scientist or two scientists who said, well, no, I think it's exaggerated. No, I don't believe in climate change. Here's my data. And so that would be, so you're balancing out 2,000 scientists with one scientist who says otherwise, because that's our obligation, is to show both sides of the story. Well, there are not two sides to the climate change story. There are different aspects of it. And the people who were those two scientists that we would dig up in order to have a balanced story, we would find out later that they're paid for by the oil and gas company, that their so-called research was actually just propaganda. Well, we just couldn't figure out how to sort through that. Now we're seeing it again with people who are proposing things that are so dangerous. We hear them saying things that are patently untrue, and we just keep trying to pick away at the facts, and so this fact isn't true, and to show you how much this is true or not true. And it doesn't serve anybody. You can't possibly understand. You can't possibly penetrate this, because the point isn't to have you understand what is true for you to accept or not accept these lies. It's just to destroy your ability to even care or even notice whether something's true or not. This is how Vladimir Putin rolls, right? He just says whatever he wants, and he says, no, we didn't invade Ukraine. We're just defending Russia. Well, he invaded Ukraine, but Russians go, well, I don't know, he says this, you say that. I don't know what's true. And that's where we're going. That's where we're heading.
As you say in the epilogue, Donald Trump's just the wrecking ball. Viktor Orban, or worse, Vladimir Putin, is what follows.
Yeah.
Well, it is a weighty book, and I appreciate the opportunity to get to talk to you about it, Carol. It's At a Loss for Words, Conversation in Age of Rage. Thanks very much for making time today.
Well, thank you, Michael. I enjoyed the conversation.